Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Do know that we hold questions until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible for us to get through all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in in the chat box right now, so you can check the chat box right now to sign in. If you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, you'll keep an eye on the chat box near the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, in the chat will be a link to a survey that you can complete for CEU credits. Make sure you bookmark, open up, otherwise reserve that link before the webinar closes. And once you complete the survey, make sure you save a copy of the certificate. We don't have access to those certificates after the fact. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Judge Steve Leifman's discussion of decriminalizing mental illness is now available on our YouTube channel. The recording for this week's talk should also be available on our YouTube channel sometime later this week, and a version of PowerPoint slides for those that have registered for the talk will be available later this week as well. And as a heads up, next week we have Dr. Nancy Panza, who will be discussing pre-employment evaluations for first responders. But circling back to this week, I'm excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be overviewing AI use in forensic psychology practice, policy, and research. This is Dr. Jenny Christman. Dr. Christman is a board-certified forensic psychologist based in Washington, D.C. She's the forensic specialist appointed to the American Board of Professional Psychology's Artificial Intelligence Task Force, which includes APA, the National Register, and other psychology organizations. She recently presented and moderated a panel on artificial intelligence at the American Academy of Forensic Psychology Conference in Washington, D.C. Dr. Christman is the Director of Training for D.C. Superior Court's Child Guidance Clinic. She's worked in court systems, forensic hospitals, and correctional facilities across the U.S. She specializes in juvenile forensic assessment, parental fitness, and veterans disability exams. She is on the board of directors for the American Board of Forensic Psychology and was featured on the Forensic Psychologist Podcast and in Psychology Today. So Dr. Christman, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for joining our series, and I know we're excited for you sharing your expertise on a very topical issue today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Sure. Great. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, today. So for our disclosure, the disclaimer, the views expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions of the University of New Mexico. The presenter does not have a financial arrangement related to the content of this activity. And yeah, so today we have 3 learning objectives. First is obviously to describe the potential risks and benefits of using AI in forensic practice. Also to develop some strategies for mitigating or reducing the possibility of misuse of AI in forensic work. And then our third one is to talk about bias. So identifying ways that AI could be perpetuating bias and discrimination in mental health care, in the criminal justice system, and in daily life. And then, of course, after that, to talk about strategies for reducing these types of inequities. Next slide. So today is part 1 in part 5 of a practical series on AI use by forensic psychologists within this law and mental health series. The next one is in 2 weeks with Dr. Dana Foreman. Our group of colleagues presented a panel at AAFP recently on AI in forensic psychology. This is our AI team group, if you will. So we received a lot of requests afterwards to continue sharing our knowledge with the forensic community. And so for those of you who joined us at AAFP, thank you, first of all. And second of all, we're going to try and make today not as repetitive. We want to make sure that we can introduce some new things. So I'm going to talk about the introduction that we had before, as well as some more forensic specific parts. And then the subsequent talks by my colleagues are going to expand further. And since these webinars are recorded, then attendees can go back and refer to prior ones if they want to refresh on some of the topics. Next slide, please. So for today, our agenda is obviously talking about AI, the basics. Then we'll talk about AI in psychology specifically. We'll move on to some pitfalls for psychologists who are interested in using AI or maybe even who are using it currently. We'll talk about some cues from the courts or some guidance from the courts in terms of what their temperature is and what their attitude is right now for AI use by forensic psychologists. And then we'll talk about things like ethics, training considerations for those of you who are at training sites, and then opportunities for continuing education. Next slide. So the basics for AI. There's been some lack of clarity or maybe a lack of consensus about what AI actually is, even among some practitioners who are using AI. So this first section is going to explain what AI is, how it works, just essentially operationalizing AI within the scope and context of forensic practice. Next slide. So what is AI? It refers to machines that are simulating human intelligence. AI systems can perform tasks that typically require human intelligence or cognition. And this can range from all kinds of tasks, from reading and analyzing large sets of data to finding patterns, making decisions, creating new images, video, translating language, the list goes on. Next slide. So how does AI work? Like, how do we get from the prompt or the instructions that we give to the AI to then the content or the answers that are generated by the AI in response? So AI reads and processes information from data sets that already exist, like the internet. AI learns from this data and then is going to generate an answer based on what's most likely. So maybe not necessarily what's accurate, but what seems to be the most likely answer based on what it's approximated from the data that it's been looking at and processing. So the format of the response is going to often mimic what is the format of the data or maybe the prompts that you entered. So for example, ChatGPT is very conversational. You write in a couple of sentences about your request, and then it usually responds in a more conversational format. But you can request a different format. You can ask for maybe a numbered list or bullet points. You can ask for it to be in a chart or a graph, but ordinarily it's going to be portrayed in the same format as the information in the prompts. You may hear about this idea of a black box. This refers to how an AI algorithm works in a way that we can't actually see. We don't know exactly how it works, which makes it a little bit harder to see what kind of the processes are, but we're able to get the output on our end. Next slide. So how is an AI created? AI is developed through collecting relevant data or using a pre-existing data set and training the AI on that data through things like simulation exercises, algorithmic learning, prediction, data analysis. The AI's decisions and output is going to be continually self-evaluated. So it's going to have an ongoing review of its output, its answers, its accuracy. Ongoing evaluation and improvement is necessary so an AI can stay relevant and make sure it's staying accurate as the world evolves and as the AI receives new information. Next slide. So there's three main types of AI. So we've got narrow AI, which is what we mostly have now. It tends to specialize in a very particular task. General AI is able to understand and learn anything that humans can. And super intelligent AI outperforms us in all ways. So it could be if you've seen the Terminator movie, for example, or the show Person of Interest, which is a little bit older, but it's a show about our world being taken over by an ASI. So these are the different types of AI. Hopefully we won't get to super intelligent AI anytime soon, but the next few slides are to talk about the most common categories or platforms for AI. Next slide. So the first one is LLMs or large language models. You may be more familiar with this. This is like ChatGPT or Claude. LLMs are trained on very large data sets like the internet. The goal of an LLM is to be able to understand and then generate human-like language. The capabilities for an LLM include data collection and summary, language content creation or written content creation, chatbots, which is sometimes called conversational AI, language translation, sometimes accessibility. Next slide. So generative AI or Gen AI This is AI that uses algorithms to create new content. This could be images, audio, video, and it's going to do this based on learned patterns from existing content. And so examples of this might be Adobe's Firefly or Midjourney. Next slide. Forecasting AI is the next sort of category. This is using information to predict next steps. So predictive AI, it analyzes past data to predict outcomes in the future. And prescriptive AI is sort of the next step. So based on the prediction that it has, it suggests what to do next. So for example, route optimization for deliveries, auto adjustments to a stock portfolio. Next slide. Agentic AI is something that you may be hearing about more. This refers to an AI system that continues to act on your behalf over time in accordance with certain parameters or expectations that you set, and it follows certain goals or initiatives that you want. So, like a stock portfolio adjusting AI, for example. Next slide. So here are some ways that AI is already in our lives. AI it's here in many ways. Some of them are easy to see: GPS route calculation, voice assistants like Siri, streaming services such as Netflix that says you like this show, maybe you'll like this show. Targeted ads on social media. Could be some smart home applications. So, for example, AI assisted Ring cameras, or maybe AI algorithms that help a Google Nest better learn your temperature settings. Then there are some that are less identifiable. So dynamic pricing is when AI algorithms manipulate what you pay for things. Flight costs can change based on things like your device's location and the time of day. Kroger is having digital price tags that change the cost of groceries based on what the customer looks like they can afford. Um, AI can be used to screen applications for jobs by colleges. I think about 83% of companies now are using AI to screen applications. Companies use AI to make larger decisions. Large-scale surveillance by the government uses AI algorithms. Basically, AI is very quietly contributing and influencing to major aspects of our lives, sometimes to our benefit and our ease, sometimes to our disadvantage, but often without our knowledge or approval. Next slide. So in terms of AI with psychology, AI is a dynamic and generating form of tech that in some ways can approximate what we do as psychologists. AI is probably at this point best used for streamlining, expediting, or automating parts of your practice and enhancing some traditional methods with more efficiency and objectivity. Next slide. So here are some ways to streamline your private practice or admin tasks. This can be anywhere from advertising, like creating a website, or print materials. Durable is a really cool app. It will make a perfect website for you in less than 30 seconds. I tried it once. It's really amazing. Content creation, this could be making psychoeducational handouts for your clients or slide decks. Communication, as I talked about earlier, chatbots, maybe referral forms or intake forms, could be virtual assistants or calendar integration. There are a lot of AIs that you can use for record review. These are just a couple. Transcription services are also very common. There's a lot of different options. These are just a few of them. You could transcribe your session notes or evaluation notes, and there are some for research. Next slide. So another way that you could potentially be using AI to enhance the traditional methods that you have are, for example, some assistance with report writing. So not necessarily writing your reports for you by scratch, but maybe a recommendations bank that you've created. So if you have a report with certain diagnoses or certain topics of interest that you might have an AI that can pull up some different recommendations. It could be helpful for reviewing your language, so maybe simplifying some of the jargon or making sure that your points are clear. For those of you who may do interventions as well, some support outside of sessions like therapy chatbots, which can be more accessible, more cost-effective, some wearables, and maybe the data can be integrated. But overall, you want to make sure that you're not replacing the practice that you have. You want to make sure that you know when you should or should not be using AI. So next slide. What AI can't do yet, in parentheses. Personalized interpretation of data. So Altogether, AI can summarize the things that it reads or it has access to, but it's not very good at synthesizing written data with other important information from an evaluation that's more nuanced or that the AI doesn't have access to. A good example is behavioral observations in the session. So it's important to evaluate when and how to integrate this into your practice, and then when your judgment is still required. Next slide. So what AI is not. A lot of psychologists believe that the auto-generated output from personality testing is AI, but it's not. That is more scripted and programmed based on the scores. So things that are scripted and programmed, maybe even chatbots, like the ones on, for example, Amazon, if you want to return an item, those are also not AI. True AI is going to learn from the interactions that it has with you and learn from ongoing or new data, and will respond by predicting what the next step should be. So just as a quick clarification. Next slide. So we've talked so far about just kind of more general psychology and how that could be, how you could integrate AI into that. And this one is more specific to forensics. So in terms of forensic practice, AI is best used in our work for helping us to generate new ideas or to analyze existing data rather than making our decisions. So for example, it could be reviewing large sets of data. Maybe you get a pretty significant discovery file or digital files. Maybe it can review some hospital records or body cam footage. Could also do some research for you, like finding some relevant case law, finding base rates, prevalence data, or maybe some empirical literature that's going to support the opinion that you have. Obviously, as we discussed earlier, maybe some ways for transcribing your notes, simplifying language in your reports. Could also potentially be used for activities or interactive exercises such as, pretend you're an attorney. Here is the opinion that I have. Here are some concerns I have. If you were the attorney, what are some points that you might want to bring up? Or, these are issues that I'm concerned about having brought up on cross-exam. What might be some tactics for countering that? Next slide. So again, kind of reiterating, something we should not be using AI for is making our decisions. So formulating our conclusions or our opinions, definitely not writing our reports start to finish, scoring and interpreting test results. So some of my colleagues have used AI to, just experimentally to try and score some different forensic measures to varying degrees of success or not. Risk assessment is also something that we don't want to be using AI yet for, and I'll talk about that a little bit later today. So just overall, we shouldn't be using AI to make our decisions or replace our judgment. Next slide. Here are some pitfalls potentially for forensic psychologists. It could be for those of us who are considering to start using AI, or maybe even those of us who have started using it for our practice. First of all, believing all AI is accurate, evidence-based, and bias-free. We're thinking, well, we as humans are subjective beings, and AI seems like it's very objective. That's definitely not the case. Thinking AI can do all the work for you and you can just kind of sit back with a Mai Tai on the beach. There's definitely still going to be plenty of work that you'll be doing as well. Using AI to compensate for lack of skill, not knowing where the data that you put into an AI is going to be kept and used by that AI, not understanding how AI content is actually created or generated, over relying on AI for quickness or expedience, but not really checking up on it or overseeing. And probably most importantly is not questioning whether this task actually needs human judgment or our judgment as expert forensic psychologists instead. So just because you can use AI doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Some of you may be familiar, a study came out earlier this year that indicated that using AI for certain tasks can subsequently reduce your ability to do those tasks yourself in the future. It can negatively impact your critical thinking skills. So again, just things to consider. Next slide. So this part will get into those issues with accuracy that I referenced earlier. Next slide. So as I discussed, never assume that AI generated content is going to be totally accurate, no errors. It's sort of like a Wikipedia page. You maybe want to look it up, but definitely verify. AI is only as good as the data that it's based on. And AI can and will give you different answers over time if you use the same instructions or prompts over the span of a couple different days, or maybe every so often over the course of months, you're going to get different answers. AI prioritizes being quick and fast and responsive over accuracy. As I talked about earlier, AI generated content is based on what seems to be most likely, not necessarily based on factual analysis and a true understanding of the data. Next slide. I'm sure many of you have heard about hallucinations. So this basically means seeing information that isn't there. So for forensic psychologists, more specifically, this is going to look like generated information such as court cases that actually weren't found, articles or evidence that isn't real. So AI predicts information or gives answers based on patterns in the data that it reviewed for training and not an actual understanding. So as we talked about before, AI is really designed to be helpful and quick and fluent. If it's not really sure of what the actual answer is, or maybe there's some data that's missing, as we'll talk about later today as well, it may fill in the gaps by just kind of filling in information that isn't there, but that will support the information or the content that it's generating. Next slide. So there's this idea that if you adjust the prompts that you're using, that it can fix all of this. Adjusting some of your prompts or making them more specific to your task, or just kind of better communicating with this AI about what you're looking for, it can be helpful, but it definitely cannot fix everything. Every AI has internal settings that we can't necessarily see or change that can impact how accurate the response is or how comprehensive or succinct it is. I won't go into details about this, but these are just some examples of internal notches and modulations that may be affecting the content that we're getting. Next slide. So the next section is talking about bias and inequity in AI. Next slide. So this is an important area that I want us to be thinking about as our society becomes increasingly AI integrated. So we've talked about already how AI learns from existing data sets. AI is really a microcosm of society. It's reflective of its time, its content, and its context, as well as its creators. The creators of an AI, their ideas, their beliefs, stereotypes, their values are inadvertently encoded into the systems that they make. So as a great example, in 2015, Amazon created a hiring tool to screen resumes, and it gave this AI 10 years of hiring decisions and resumes to learn from. And the AI found a hiring bias that preferred male candidates to female candidates. And instead of flagging this like, hey, Amazon, this data is showing that you're having a bias towards who you're hiring and you should probably fix it. Nope. The AI tool said, okay, well, this is a pattern that we're learning. This is fact. So let's make sure that we're staying on this track. So it actually amplified what was going on with the bias. It ended up selecting only male candidates and screening out all female candidates. And AI, Amazon had to stop using the AI for the resumes for that particular reason. Next slide. So what are the sources of bias that can be integrated into this AI? So one could be the training data, which can contain discriminatory or biased pattern. For example, LLMs that train on the internet, for all the good and the bad that the internet has for us. Could be potentially using biased metrics. So there was a healthcare AI app that used health expenses as the metric of need. And so this analyzed data, and it decided that rich white people were the people with the most dire health needs. It didn't really have that background context, though, about things like wealthier people being able to afford out-of-pocket costs or maybe more expensive procedures. It didn't have the context about underserved communities or maybe some communities of color that don't have as much access to specialists or care. There could also be missing data for underrepresented groups like non-binary people. And so this could be impactful for the data that the AI is trained on. The next part is algorithmic bias. So errors that are creating this bias end up being encoded and built into how the AI actually works. It ends up being embedded into the predictions and the responses that this AI is generating, which means that it's going to be replicating, perpetuating this bias while seeming very objective and neutral and computer system savvy. And another source could be the users themselves. So whether it's the prompts or the instructions that you enter for this AI, or maybe how you interpret the output. Next slide. So how did we get here? The vast majority of AI software creators, developers, leaders, people who make management decisions, maybe people who make financial decisions or investments, are white men. And so, as we talked about earlier, AI systems are built around their creators' beliefs, what they think we need an AI for, what would be helpful for an AI, different values, implicit biases. And the data that they have is their prototype. So, why does this matter? Why does this actually matter in terms of what we're going to discuss today? AI that's trained on data from the majority group can be less accurate for people from minoritized groups. Studies have already shown that there's 3 times more data points for men than for women. And to my knowledge, there isn't even published data right now regarding the ratio of data points for non binary people. And just altogether, biased algorithms worsen pre existing disparities. AI has been shown to continue to benefit people with privilege and to further disadvantage people who don't have as many societal privileges. Next slide. So here's some examples of kind of everyday bias. As I talked about, AI systems are reflective of the priorities and the preferences of their creators. So these servient voice assistants that we have here at your beck and call, by default, have female voices and names instead of male voices and names. Later iterations, you can choose a male voice or different kinds of voices, but the summoning word is still typically a woman's name. AI generated images of women tend to be more sexualized, more voluptuous. They are often smiling. Images of men tend to make them more kind of stern and muscular, but it's basically imagery that's reflecting what the creators would prefer to see. So the construct of the male gaze, for those of you who are familiar, I am sure that there are some women on this call who have been told, you should smile more. It's just something we end up being told. So the images sort of fulfill this. LGBTQIA plus users, social media use or internet use tends to be flagged at least twice as often, which is tied to heteronormative algorithms and ideals. Training data for AI often omits, whether it's inadvertently or on purpose, omits data for the perspectives and needs of people with disabilities, and accessible content isn't always created. Healthcare AI apps are less accurate for trans people and for women because healthcare studies and medical studies focus on men. They are the prototype for data collection. I think it was actually it's either 1991 or 93. I think it was 1993 that they had to pass laws requiring medical studies to include women and people of color. Name discrimination is also something you may see with AI algorithms. This means less favorable outcomes for applicants with names that are not traditionally associated with people of white or European descent. And just generally, a lot of the algorithms, as I discussed earlier, they tend to favor people who are with privilege. So, next slide, please. So I talked about earlier, how is this forensically relevant? Well, if we're looking at the legal system itself, there's been some studies that show much higher facial recognition inaccuracy rates for some of us in our community. So it has a less than 1% inaccuracy rate for white men, but up to 36% inaccuracy for women of color. False positive matches for mugshots have been up to 10 times higher for men of color. This obviously is not just a mere inconvenience. This is risk of wrongful arrest, interrogation, imprisonment, now deportation. CBP, Border Patrol, has been known to use an AI that had some faulty retinal scanning, and they weren't able to actually detect what was going on, partly because of the black box phenomenon and proprietary algorithms, but it can be very relevant. In terms of youth, as we know, young people have been using AI more, but police contact, studies have shown that any kind of police contact, whether it's random or neutral, tends to increase the likelihood for future contact. The school to prison pipeline and just generally school-based patterns of oppression. If you have a school AI that's learning from historical data regarding disproportionate discipline rates, dropout rates, disability classifications for students of color, this could, set people up with lower expectations, possibly fewer opportunities, a quickness to respond more punitively to students of color. It tends to monitoring for distress or threat risk or sexual content tends to disproportionately flag students who have disabilities and LGBTQIA students. So again, as I said, this could potentially replicate some patterns of oppression and just facilitate these pathways to legal involvement. Next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, violence risk. This might seem like one of the most interesting uses for AI. We might think like, okay, well, we as humans, we're subjective. Our estimates and projections could be maybe wrong. So, I've got these factors, these variables about this particular examinee. Let's plug it into this algorithm, and it can, use that data and come up with a perfect estimate of risk. But that's not quite true, as we've talked about earlier. There are a couple of AI risk assessment algorithms that already exist, not necessarily psychology ones, but ones that are used in the courts. So at least 50% of states have been using these kinds of algorithms for decisions anywhere from bond amounts to pretrial detention, sentencing guidelines. And these have been already shown to have bias, at least twice as likely to rate people of color as higher risk, especially women of color, as opposed to white people, especially white men. These risk assessments have been shown to rely mostly on static risk factors and not dynamic ones. Some of the risk factors are similar to the ones that are in our measures, so things like prior number of arrests. It also uses factors such as zip code and other things like parents' wealth or parents' education. And this black box phenomenon, again, we don't really know how these different risk factors are weighed. So just overall, like using AI now for violence risk with where the science stands, it's going to be trained in using historical data that has bias. It'll essentially, if we're thinking about using AI for who is, quote, more dangerous based on prior data, it's going to continue to have output that's going to uphold unjust structures already without this knowledge in the context that we as experts and forensic psychologists have. So, for example, unrelated factors like the static risk factor for rearrest without thinking about stuff like some communities being over-policed, higher rates of traffic stops, other considerations for parole conditions, for example, if you have someone who maybe has lower vision and the only way that people are able to find jobs is from online portals. So it could be replicating these patterns without larger knowledge. Not to say that we'll never be able to do risk assessment with AI. I mean, that very well may be coming, but just as the state of affairs now, it's not advised. Next slide. So more about forensic practice. How is this? These are kind of theoretical things. So then what is this going to look like in terms of what we do day to day? Voice recognition and transcription software that we may be using to transcribe our notes. They tend to be less accurate for women, for people of color, people who are older or younger, people with accents, non-native English speakers, people with speech disabilities, and in terms of content, slang or culturally specific references or phrases. And so some of these are people that we disproportionately see in our work as forensic psychologists. We talked earlier about kind of hiring bias. So if you have attorneys who are starting to use AI to find and hire forensic psychologists, they may be more likely to hire male or white psychologists. And if we're looking at creating current decisions and outcomes based on prior data, more likely to underpay women or psychologists of color. Excuse me. There's an AI app called Genderfy it would use names and titles and email addresses to decide someone's gender. And women who had doctor in their names were misidentified as men. Even Dr. Megan Smith, they found, was misidentified as a man like 75% of the time. So just being thoughtful about when we use AI, what that can look like. Next screen. So we've talked a lot about the bias that's there. So what can we do to prevent against it or hopefully reduce it? First of all, just this understanding similar to test norms, like knowing what the data is that this AI was trained on. Does it include data sets and population groups that are representative of your case, of your evaluee, and the jurisdiction that you work in? Ensuring that transcription AI that you use is going to be accurate for the evaluee that you see. Being thoughtful about the data and the background information that you provide about your client. And another thing is there are a lot of options for this, but fairness and bias checkers. So these are just a couple, but there are a lot of them that have been developed. There are ways you can check to see if the particular platform that you're using has biased output. And if you find that that's the case, you can adjust your use accordingly or maybe try a different one. Next slide. Some other options, just being aware of this, like just being familiar with that AI does have some biases and that it can be impactful for the users, us. Talking to our colleagues or attorneys or the courts about the benefits and the risks of AI, as well as how to mitigate it if we're aware that bias and inequalities can be inherent in AI use, especially the ones that I talked about earlier. Being able to discuss ways to reduce the impact of that is great. Maybe other things like supporting research, funding publications by our community. Next slide. So this next part is about data security. Next slide. So an AI can only give you information about an examinee if you use very case-specific data. So what happens to that data when you put it in? Most AI platforms store submitted content on their servers indefinitely. They use it to continue to train the AI, or even just to have as background information that it can continue to reference for future content. And it's without our control after it's in the AI. If after it's on those servers, we can't necessarily retract it. So this data could be shared or leaked or used. More recently, we're seeing sometimes data being used to target people for political views or maybe based on documentation status. Usually publicly available AI like ChatGPT is not HIPAA compliant. Next slide. So you want to make sure that if you are going to use any kind of AI tool, you should make sure that it is HIPAA compliant. There are some good standards. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology has some helpful standards for this. There is an FDA approval process for what it calls digital therapeutics. You may be able to have an LLM sign a business agreement or a BAA that it's not going to store or use the data that you put into it. Making sure that you understand their privacy policies and third policy data sharing. This next part we'll talk a little bit more later, but making sure that you inform people in advance how and why you're using AI, making sure that they know how their data could potentially be used, making sure they understand, and just overall just not entering sensitive or identifying data. Next slide. So for this next section, we're going to talk more about how this interacts with the courts, what the courts' attitudes have been so far. Next slide. So AI is continually evolving very quickly. And so then even if we do have published standards or cases, maybe they can be outdated pretty quickly. So where do you maybe want to start looking for data on how the courts are viewing AI? There is National Conference of State Legislatures. Their website has a tracker for state legislation and bills that are being passed regarding AI. The National Center for State Courts also has a tracker on its website that tracks state court decisions or findings regarding AI matters. Different states may have their own policies. In Maryland and some other jurisdictions, I think Texas recently, there have been incidents where a forensic psychologist was found in court to have used AI in their evaluation practice without disclosing it. And so some states and agencies have been creating statements and guidance for AI use or, prohibiting AI use. Related organizations such as the American Bar Association, they have published some guidance about AI. So there are different ways that you can start following how the community is seeing AI use. Next slide. Something to be aware of is that attorneys are increasingly running our reports through AI checker software. This could be to see if AI was used and just not disclosed by the evaluator, which is a great way to discredit an expert, I would say, to be able to check if the sources and citations are accurate or if they are hallucinated, as we talked about earlier. Might be to just summarize a really long report because some of the reports that we may have are pretty comprehensive, shall we say, or maybe translating some jargon. So, but it's becoming increasingly commonplace that this is happening. Next slide. So thinking about even admissibility and if our AI use can even be potentially considered in court. So if we consider things like Daubert, Fry, federal rules of evidence, guidance such as expert testimony and work products should be informed by methods that are peer-reviewed, that are testable, have known error rates, generally accepted. Based on this guidance, do we feel like AI is going to meet those thresholds right now? Is there a known error rate for forensic psychologists who use AI? Is it even generally accepted in our field so far? So even if we're going to be thinking about using AI in our practice as forensic practitioners, is this something that would even meet the thresholds for being able to come to court? Next slide. So just thinking even about testimony. Do you feel confident explaining to the court what AI is? So not necessarily even your own use of it, but like what AI is. Do you feel comfortable talking about that? Can you explain AI as thoroughly as you can explain your own forensic practice, your opinions, what led to your opinions, kind of what your assessment process is, thinking, reasoning process? Are you able to explain how you used AI, why you used it, like in what points in your evaluation process that you used AI, why you decided to default to that instead of your own judgment? And what challenges might you see on cross-exam? I can imagine many challenges. So what are some potential challenges that you could see in that regard? These are just some things to consider before making a decision whether you want to start using AI in your reports. So next slide. This part is going to talk about more forensic specific ethics matters. Next slide. Thinking about transparency. So data should be made available for review and scrutiny by the judiciary, making sure that we can disclose limitations of our opinions. So just a generally good rule of thumb is to make sure that you're citing your use of AI in your reports. You want to say how and why AI was used, maybe the platforms and the prompts that you used. For example, if you're looking into some literature and you look at different studies, sometimes they'll talk about, we pulled some different information. We pulled prior studies using these particular search parameters. We used these journal databases. So as an example, some of my colleagues' future talks are going to include things like, potential ways of phrasing your AI use in reports. So that's some helpful guidance that you might want to look out for in the future. Making sure that you're notifying people in advance. If you have an attorney or somebody else who wants to hire you, they're hiring you because of your expertise. You're a doctoral level psychologist. They want to figure out what your opinions are, and you want to make sure that you're clarifying all the tools that you're using at your disposal. And also evaluees, if you are engaging a practice that allows for informed consent by clients, like written informed consent, you want to make sure that you have it in there. And even if it's a forensic evaluation that relies more on assent or notification of purpose, still making sure that it's clear and making sure that they understand. So in addition to other kind of considerations such as maybe language barriers or competency, also thinking about things like tech savviness, how much do they understand, maybe even some mistrust of technology. Basically, if you're not disclosing your use of AI, ask yourself why. Do you have a sense that other people may not accept it, that you worry what other people might think? Either way, if you have some hesitation for disclosing your use, does it suggest maybe a sense of wrongdoing? So, just being thoughtful about being upfront about what you're using. Next slide. So thinking about some standards that might be able to guide our practice. APA in June of this year, they released some ethical guidelines for AI use by psychologists. Last year, they published a statement on AI as well. And so when these slides come out, you should be able to hopefully find these references from the links, or you can just look it up yourself. Forensics, as our field, does not yet have specific or published standards for AI use. So definitely want to keep an eye out for that as those are forthcoming. Next slide. So just thinking about other policies. So does your organization, your agency have a policy on AI use? More than yes or no, like yes, we can, no, we can't use it. Which platforms are permitted? What purposes is this permitted for? And if you don't have a policy, or maybe even if you do, just thinking about creating your own, whether it's for you just personally as a practitioner, or maybe if you own a private practice. Just some things to consider when you're putting together a policy. What do you consider to be AI? So is that content that's entirely generated by AI? Does that refer to your own rough draft or your writing that you then use AI to fine tune? What does your jurisdiction or your court system seem to think about AI right now? Is there formal guidance? Like, have there been recent court cases or decisions? Considering what is the kind of attitude amongst your peers. So maybe other psychologists or colleagues, other attorneys, like what is the jurisdiction generally thinking about AI? So, some jurisdictions may be more or less welcoming. As we said earlier, I'm based in DC, and DC has started to use AI more. DC courts has created a policy for AI use, and it does have ways of using AI that are supported or allowed. And just has guidelines for what it is or what can and can't be used. Thinking about what tasks do you want to use AI for? That could be helpful for considering your policy. Making sure that your policy is going to have ways for protecting patient privacy. If you're going to have a policy about what you use or what you don't, it should also include ways for protecting your clients and your data. Also, being thoughtful if you're a training site or you supervise students, are the expectations going to be different for them? So, for example, as I talked about DC courts, we have an AI policy as an organization, but for us at our training clinic, we've been able to discuss with our trainees what are our expectations for their use of AI or refinement tools. Next slide. So some helpful guide for selecting an AI tool if this is something you want to do. APA has a really great step-by-step guide for looking at different ones. It has a checklist that you can use afterwards to make sure you're hitting all those points. Some of the discussion points or things that APA suggests that you think about are, were psychologists involved in the creation of this AI, or do they serve in advisory boards or feedback? What's the privacy policy for this particular AI? What tech support might be available in the event that you have some issues with it? Next slide. So something else to think about is in forensic psychology training. So some of the current students, not all of them, but some of them, and then definitely upcoming students are going to be incorporating AI into their learning. Elementary schools, high schools, colleges, they are incorporating AI, maybe in terms of their learning, but also just like how to use it, because AI is pretty much the way of the future at this point. And so, writing refinement tools may be commonplace for some of your students. So it's just important to make sure that you're telling your trainees what your organization's policies are. Your own expectations as well, being very specific about this because you're responsible for the content and the style of their work. You may have some students who think like, well, for my papers, I use Grammarly or something that helps with my writing. So, I'm going to do the same thing for my report writing. But without then kind of the additional consideration of, yes, maybe that's kind of how they're writing up the reports, but then you're now their supervisor and now you're submitting reports to the court that have AI content. And so what is that going to mean on the back end? And how is that maybe going to impact you as their supervisor? So you might want to consider using AI checking tools for report review. You may not, maybe that's something you're interested in, but something to consider. Grammarly and Turnitin have some AI tools that you could potentially use. They can it'll detect things like AI generated content. It can also detect things that were human generated, but AI refined. And so that may be something that's helpful. But also, some guidance for students is making sure that you inform your supervisor whether you like to use AI tools for your writing and why. Your supervisor may be fine with this. Your supervisor might be somebody who uses AI for the same, and then that's great. But just making sure that you're upfront about it. Many forensic training sites right now are not really welcoming for AI use from students. So, if you have a site that is using content checkers for AI and you have a student whose work is showing up with AI content, maybe it could be seen in a negative way or So you just want to be thoughtful about that. But on the other side, it also means that the student is not really going to be developing those writing refinement skills on their own. If you're having a tool that's going to help streamline your writing or make it more smoother, it means that you're not actually getting to develop those skills yourself, which is kind of a disservice to you and your training. And also, AI refined writing may remove some of the important nuances in what we do. There's a lot of what we do and we know as forensic psychologists revolves around, and when we write our reports, what is the language that we should use? How do we make sure that our writing is formal enough for the courts, but is not full of jargon? How do we make sure that we're getting things across? So if you use something to smooth over your writing, it may take out some of those nuances. But this is not to say that AI can't be used at all. Like, AI could be helpful. There might be ways that you could use AI to supplement your students' training. One of my colleagues, as I had talked about earlier, he uses AI in different ways to help with some of his students' training, interviewing skills, things like that. And not just that, but what maybe could you learn from your students about using AI? Us as psychologists, I feel like the further we go in our lives and our careers, the more so our students are on the up and coming end of things. So, we might be able to learn from our students about AI, the positives and negatives. I think some of us maybe are on the more mistrustful side. Then there are going to be some of us who are really supportive of AI use. Just altogether, what are some ways we can put our heads together and figuring out how to learn more about this technology and how it can be used, or maybe not. Next slide. So something we want to give thought to when it comes to forensic ethics is competence. So ethics codes often talk about making sure that we're practicing within our competence and our scope. So how do I know if I'm competent to use AI per se? This is something you might want to ask yourself, but something, maybe a comparison point is, how do you know that you're competent to use a new test or to start doing a new type of evaluation? Some questions to ask yourself might be, can I actually do the tasks that I'm now using AI to complete? If I didn't have AI, are these still things I could do myself? Is AI streamlining my practice, or am I going to be using AI as a crutch or to do things that I can't do? And also being thoughtful about what are some challenges maybe to maintaining our competence. We've already talked today about how AI is evolving very quickly. So what might be some challenges that you might foresee there? And where can I find ongoing education? How can I stay up to date? Next slide. So ways to learn more, the AITF, ABEP has an AI task force, as we mentioned a little bit earlier. It's an inter-organizational committee that's the point of it is basically to provide psychologists with more education and tools and knowledge for being able to use AI. So it has podcasts, it has articles, webinars. It's something you can easily find online, but this is a really good resource because it's specifically made for psychologists with practice at the forefront. It's not just, part of it is understanding, but also part of it is like tools for use and how to make sure that you're using it effectively and appropriately. Next slide. So as I talked about earlier, our AI team, some of our upcoming topics are going to be demonstrating AI use. So like videos or screenshots of how you could actually use AI, what it looks like, some prompt training, so ways to better communicate with AI tools, some advanced practice considerations, such as I discussed earlier, like citing how you use AI in your reports or how to communicate with attorneys. There's going to be some discussion about ethical points, more kind of like finer tuned points about ethics. There's actually a worksheet, like a specific worksheet for ethical dilemmas that some of my colleagues have created that can help you map out solving ethical problems, which is great. And so, yeah, here's just some other topics that we'll address. There has been a call that has gone out recently for APLS topics that are specific to AI. So if you're interested in, looking to a future APLS, they may have more topics on AI. I know that AAFP is planning to continue incorporating AI-related topics. So I think overall as a field, we're being thoughtful about making sure that all of us are more comfortable and knowledgeable about AI. Next slide. So generally the takeaways today, AI should be used as an assistant or an augment, not a replacement. Can be generating ideas, but not, generating your opinions. Making sure that you know when human judgment is required. AI can be really helpful or speed things up, but making sure that you know when your own qualitative judgment is required. Making sure that you're not just assuming AI is correct, making sure you're verifying everything that it comes up with. Just basically being thoughtful about the data that you enter, not entering identifiable information, making sure that you're recording and documenting your use of AI, taking some actions to reduce bias and inequity in AI, and engaging in some continuing education to make sure that you are maintaining your AI literacy. Next slide. So now here we are for the references. Here are a couple of potential resources and the QR code for evaluation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Christman, for that very insightful and helpful overview. As you can tell from the sheer number of questions that are in the chat, a lot of people have been interested and have follow-up questions about AI's use in forensic psychology practice. As Dr. Christman noted here, this series of team has a lot of topical issues and discussion focuses on AI's use in forensic psychology. We're in discussions right now of having several of these being presented through the Law and Mental Health series, but they are, as they mentioned, presenting at AAFP and a number of different avenues to learn more. Shortly, there will be in the chat box a link for the APA Continuing Education Survey. Here is the QR code for you to be able to also access that survey directly as well. We, of course, will not be possible to get through all of these questions or even most of them for that matter, but I'll try to integrate as many as possible because we do see several different types of themes coming up, many that you did already touch on. One question that several people had was in relationship to using AI and past references to people using AI in legal argumentations and it generating fake citations. And so a lot of people had thoughts about, or questions about how to avoid that. Somebody wrote, I recently watched a video where an attorney used AI that created new case laws that they were arguing, and this was uncovered by the judge. She mentioned about forwarding this to the bar. I imagine it's very easy for us as psychologists to fall into this as well. While I know we should always review our work before submitting to the court, do you see this becoming a major problem with our field as AI becomes more prevalent and used?
Yeah, I think that kind of as I discussed is making sure that you check if you're using an AI to say like, hey, I'm looking for some base rates or some evidence that's going to support this. Is there prior precedent for this opinion or this particular approach to an evaluation? It may pull up a lot of things, and then you just want to make sure that you can find it on your own. It's helpful rather than you having to do the search yourself, but then if there is a list, definitely making sure that you check it. It's hard to say if this is ever going to be something that can be, um, prevented against. I think there are some tools that have more or less likelihood of hallucinations, but yeah, it's just kind of another way of making sure that you check the output.
Certainly. Somebody, as you noted about AI's use in higher ed and using Grammarly as an example, somebody asked about in their experience in academic settings has been that AI detectors are over-inclusive and will flag content that was not generated by AI, but may have been edited using software that relies on AI like Grammarly. In light of this, what are your thoughts on we may wish to be over-inclusive in disclosing software we use to help organize and edit reports?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point because there have been times when I used it to check some writing, and there was one where I knew even it was just kind of like as an exercise to see if that, for example, Grammarly could check, and Grammarly said it didn't have any AI content, even though it did. So it's not always going to be accurate, but it should be able to tell how much of it is fully generated and how much of it is sort of refined. But I like the idea of just being just your due diligence of making sure that you're saying like, this is what I used, this is how I used it. There are different tools that have higher specificity or higher sensitivity. One of my colleagues, Dr. Armstrong, she has some work that she does as a professor, and Dr. Foreman as well. But they've both talked about that they will sometimes use different tools just to see one that's more specific or one that's more kind of broad-based. It's great it's hard then also kind of to confirm whether or not the content that's being flagged as AI actually is. But I think if it's a student that you're working with, maybe just have a conversation with them. Say, it's becoming more of a kind of standard practice that we run students work through these checkers, and it did come up that this has some AI contributions. Let's talk about it. Is this something that you had used, and maybe it could be kind of a learning experience as well as, what made you decide you wanted to use this? How can we help you build up your skills instead? What can we do to better support you in your growth?
We'll ask a couple more questions. Just want to alert people that we are
Mhm.
at the top of the hour, but there is the link to the survey in the chat box there. Um, as you referenced there about having these conversations about disclosure, I'm seeing a lot of questions about the balance of disclosure. Some people saying, what happens if you don't disclose at all? This other question says, is there a threshold for how much AI use should be disclosed? Their example oftentimes in certain conditions seem to be like akin to using a Google search, which of course we don't usually disclose using. Sometimes we're using tools and we might not even be sure that AI is in there. They use the example
Yeah,
of Copilot now being integrated into MS Word.
right.
Sometimes people aren't even aware of this. Um, what are your recommendations in considering basically how much to disclose or
Yeah,
when to
how much to
disclose?
disclose? So that's a really good question. Some of the future talks that my colleagues are going to be doing are going to address this specifically. I know that a few of them have been working on creating actual language for their reports, not just to say that I use AI in this report, but also disclaimers about, how sometimes in our reports we'll say something like this report should not be used by unauthorized parties, but maybe adding something in there too about like this report should not be put through any kind of AI content checkers. So yeah, tuning into some of the other presentations that are forthcoming, they're going to have some more specific guidance about that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Another topic that might go into these other presentations that come up. People asked about AI and HIPAA compliance. I guess one broad question would be here is how does one check if an AI tool is HIPAA compliant? And even if it is HIPAA compliant, from your perspective right now, is it safe to use clients' names in such a tool?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's better to be safe than sorry. So being able to redact it where you can, but also the link I had in there for APA's tool, the step-by-step guide about how to pick an AI tool. It's really great. It's going to be helpful in terms of how do I find one, how do I make sure that it's HIPAA compliant. APA has some great guidance for that, so that should be helpful.
Wonderful. Well, I do want to be mindful of time. I know we have a number of questions here, but as you noted, your team is getting out there, having a lot of conversations
Mhm.
about AI use. We're hoping to have several of them, if not all of them, here on the Law and Mental Health series in the next couple of months. So, Dr. Christman, thank you so much for your work that you've done here, for generating a lot of thoughtful, insightful information and questions for our audience here as they think about their considerations of ways they could or considerations they have if they were to use AI in their practice. Thank you for that so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
And that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we have Dr. Nancy Panza, who will be discussing pre employment evaluations for first responders. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.